Well, India, despite all of Donald Trump's threats and despite the increase in tariffs on Indian goods, is still buying Russian oil again. And the state-owned oil refineries of India, Indian Oil and Bharat Petroleum, have resumed purchases of Russian oil with deliveries scheduled for September-October. The reason is simple. The Russians have increased the discount, and now Western media are reporting a discount of about $3 per barrel of Russian oil. Urals plus purchases of Warandei and Siberian Light, which are also being sold at a discount. So the Russians gave the Indians a good discount, and the Indians are ready to buy this oil despite the American tariffs. Let's examine this topic more closely. What's really happening? My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 20th. And before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So let's start with the statistics, right away with the numbers. In August, deliveries of Russian Urals oil to India dropped to the level of 400,000 barrels per day compared to an average of 1.2 million barrels per day since the beginning of this year. But as soon as the discounts, that is, the Russian price cuts, came back to life, as soon as the Russians increased this discount, India's state-owned oil refineries returned and started buying Russian oil again. Moreover, demand is also growing in China. The Chinese also realize, hey, listen, if you're giving the Indians a discount, then we'll also buy at a discount. This is basically a mirror of the sanctions, meaning the price cap. It works through discounts and logistics, but it doesn't completely stop the export of Russian oil. Moscow has already publicly confirmed its course to increase oil supplies to India and China, even at a loss, even with a big discount. In particular, today in the State Duma they stated that shipments are continuing. We see potential for exporting Russian liquefied natural gas in addition to oil. Well, the share of the Russian Federation in India's oil imports reached 40% in May, which is a record figure. Let me remind you that before Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, the share of Russian oil in all of India's imports was less than 2%. Now it's 40%. So the flow of Russian oil is alive. Grade variety is increasing, but connection differences are worsening. Washington is trying to push tariffs, and Trump imposed a 25% tariff on Indian exports and threatened to double these duties to 50% starting August 27th. And this is a response to, as stated in Washington, India's profiteering from cheap oil and supplies through gray channels. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added a jab, saying that the benefits go to some of the wealthiest families in India. But this is already an attempt, to sow some conflict inside India itself. Like, do you think you're making money from this? No, it's the wealthiest families in this country who profit from it. New Delhi calls the American tariffs unfounded and defends its right to buy from the cheapest suppliers. Why is all this important for Ukraine now? The fact is, let's put it this way, any extension of Indian demand for Russian oil is like oxygen for the budget of the Russian Federation, which pays for the war, which finances this war. And even if Russia sells oil at a big discount, it still makes some profit from it, even if it's not much. At the same time, the United States is developing the so-called aviation option to guarantee Ukraine's security. Well, in Europe, they're assembling these so-called deterrence forces, confirmation forces. They call them all sorts of names. That is, they're talking about sending a military contingent to Ukraine after the ceasefire. And today, Scott Bessent, the United States Secretary of the Treasury, spoke about the well-known 10% markup on weapons for Ukraine that Europeans are paying. And Bessent said directly, yes, we put a 10% markup on the weapons we sell to Europeans for Ukraine. We will use that money to fund the protection of Ukrainian airspace after the ceasefire. But the situation is that, while the Europeans are assembling military contingents, while they're paying for arms supplies to Ukraine, while the Americans themselves say, we take a 10% markup and we'll spend it on protecting Ukrainian airspace. All this time, they are allowing India to buy huge volumes of Russian oil, thereby filling the Russian budget to continue the war, counteracting everything that Western countries are doing right now, without coordinated efforts to fight the Russian shadow fleet with insurers, with carriers, and with transshipment in third countries. This sanctions policy will simply provide a cheap barrel to important Russian buyers. Here's what happened. There's a price cap on Russian oil, and it was lowered. There are sanctions against a certain number of tankers in Russia's shadow fleet. There are duties against India, but all of this is offset by Russia's discount on its oil. And India will take what reduces inflation. They realize it's $3 less per barrel. That's not bad. So, the European Union plus the G7 countries will have to synchronize their policies. Otherwise, this oil loophole, will be feeding the Russian war machine, while Europe will be investing money in defending Ukraine from that very same Russian aggression. But the pieces don't fit together. Unfortunately, right now, the Russian discount has beaten the American tariff. At least in the short term, that's for sure. To reverse this situation, you need not just tariff pressure, but also major improvements in logistics and the fleet. Until Russia is unable to supply oil, as long as it flows, the money keeps coming in. And this directly affects the frontline and future security guarantees for Ukraine. So, for now, I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, all.